Chapter 15, The Last Shared Value. This transformation of society leaves Americans adrift, without a universal standard like natural law against which to measure the morality of actions, without a universal standard against which to judge cultural norms or values. All foundations are shifting and unstable, and all boats are adrift. As Nathan Sharansky, a Jewish political dissident in the Soviet Union, a refusenik, who spent 9 years in Soviet prison, notes, quote, "Moral clarity provides us with a place to stand, a reference point from where to leverage our talents, ideas, and energies to create a better world. Without moral clarity, without a reference point, those same talents, ideas, and energies are just as likely to do harm as good," end quote. This is the problem with relative truth and why deciding morality and happiness based upon majority decision in a highly polarized democracy is dangerous. Sharansky recognized this. Quote, "In the free world, the competition of ideas and of parties flourishes, and allegiances are often based on a single common principle or purpose that struggles against a competing point of view. Though generally healthy for a society, this competition can be quite dangerous if we lose sight of the fact that there is a far greater divide between the world of freedom and the world of fear than there is between the competing factions within a free society. If we fail to recognize this, we lose moral clarity. The legitimate differences among us, the shades of gray in a free society, will be wrongly perceived as black and white. Then the real black and white line that divides free societies from fear societies, the real line that divides good from evil, will no longer be distinguishable. And that is actually the real reason behind writing Black and White for me as well. We have become so divided that we have started seeing shades of gray in terms of black and white. We disagree with one, maybe even very small thing with someone else, and they become our enemy in all things. Or if we agree with the person they hate on one item, or that this person they hate has made a good point, then for some reason, we are then worthy of being hated too. It's preposterous, but that is where this unraveled, culturally adrift society with no shared values has brought us. And I'm not sure there is a way to kind of shake the average American out of this way of thinking. The transformation, this part at least, has seemed to be fairly complete. The one shared value of Americans, of Western civilization, regardless of whether one was conservative or liberal, labor union or entrepreneur, old or young, man or woman, rich or poor or middle class, college educated or high school dropout, single, dating or married, New Englander or Southern born. The one shared values of Americans, no matter who they were, was that of the obvious and natural right to liberty. Freedom was the last shared value of all Americans. Yes, was. Not all Americans believe in freedom or value it. It is even being rejected outright, as those who are denying natural law feel compelled not even to secure their own liberty, but to force those who disagree with them, those who still see natural law and nature's God as superior to man-made law and state government, to submit to an absolutist state. Yes, freedom as a value is even being rejected outright, as those who are denying natural law feel compelled to force those who disagree with them to submit to an absolutist state. Freedom is no longer a defining characteristic of the technocratic utopia they are trying to create. Instead, they focus on equality and human rights, which they themselves have redefined. Sharansky saw this reality decades ago. Quote, "Today, detached from the concept of a free society, human rights have no reference point. The concept of human rights has come to mean sympathy for the poor, the weak, and the suffering. To be sure, this sympathy is essential if we want to live in moral societies and should be encouraged and cultivated by families, faiths, schools, and governments. Yet without moral clarity, sympathy can also be placed in the service of evil, end quote. Note that he says this idea of sympathy should be encouraged and cultivated by families, faiths, and schools. And then he adds governments at the end. And so because all other sources of moral authority have been systematically eliminated, we find ourselves now as a society without moral clarity. And that is how they have convinced us that the tares are wheat. This is how they have convinced a large swath of Americans that evil actions should be protected out of compassion, and that a feeling of virtue is more important than actually living a virtuous life. They convinced us that providing human rights for others necessitates giving up natural individual rights for ourselves. That is how they convinced us to exchange peace for war and empathy for contempt. In fact, this is how even those who might be able to discern the tares from wheat are prevented from uprooting the tares, as the tares are too prevalent, and to uproot them would uproot the wheat as well. To keep the wheat, we must leave the tares alone. And as this poisonous weed thrives, the wheat can't, right? It's still there, but it's languishing with having to share the nutrients. It doesn't even have the right nutrients to be developed. And it's being choked out by the imposters that have taken over the once fertile soil. Not only has this lack of moral clarity shaped the culture war at the individual personal level, but as Sharansky also argued, quote, sympathy for the weak can be manipulated by tyrants. In our television age, when pictures without context immediately influence our emotions, when cause and effect are deemed irrelevant, when only suffering is important, human sympathy and a deep desire for peace can turn into a weapon of tyranny, end quote. Thus, how the media framed the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the threat of ISIS a decade later, not to mention the Arab Spring of 2011, the Syrian civil war, and more recently the war in Ukraine or the uprisings in Iran, Venezuela, Brazil, or even China, become suspect. And why not add to the list what's happening in Israel? How the media frames the conflict plays upon the emotions of a people now driven by emotions, not facts, by feelings, not truths, by fabricated moral superiority instead of critical thinking. Friends and enemies reversal. It is this lack of moral clarity and a manipulative and emotion-driven media that can lead people living in free societies to, quote, see their fellow citizens as their enemies and foreign dictators as their friends, end quote. Not only did Americans turn on their neighbors during the severest era of the pandemic lockdowns and continue to see those who disagree with them as the enemy, but this is how Americans were convinced to abandon the Green Revolution in favor of a deal with Iran's Khomeini. This is how we allowed the genocide of the Yazidis, allowed Hezbollah to take over Lebanon, and China to suppress Hong Kong citizens without any significant pushback from the American people. This is the reason we have so quickly forgotten the women of Afghanistan who, after a generation of equality, liberty, and political power, have once again been relegated to the chador, prevented from going to school, imprisoned, and executed simply for being women. This is the reason we do not care about the artists and musicians of Afghanistan who were killed simply for shaping cultural themes or providing soothing sounds for the soul. Music is what I'm talking about. Musicians and artists, the creatives, were systematically eliminated in Afghanistan after the Taliban took over. This is a side note, but also notice that the utopias of the future, these idealist technocracies portrayed in book and film, and the ideal that I think the progressives are aiming for, they're not only do they have no pop culture, which we addressed earlier, but no high culture either. It was all destroyed. The actions of the Taliban, not to mention the iconoclasts of earlier centuries, but this demonstrates that no matter what path toward totalitarianism one takes, once that totalitarianism is achieved, creativity, individual gifts, and talents will be sacrificed on the altar of the common good. Any unapproved message, any individuality, anything even the least bit inspiring must be squashed in order to maintain total control. And you see this in the dystopian works as well, which belie the fact that our would-be controllers miscalculate human thought and behavior all the time. And these dystopias have also, warned these would-be controllers that there will always exist those who will not fall into line. So best to ensure no inspiration is available to any citizen, because how can they identify the people most likely to become inspired and break away in thought and action? So lack of moral clarity is the reason we were so readily convinced to betray the Kurdish fighters, and why we have yet to support regime change in Iran, even as the women, girls, and youth in that country shine a light on the human rights abuses that continue. We have forgotten that, quote, the great dividing line in that struggle is the line that separates free societies that thrive on dissent from fear societies that ban it. Societies that do not allow dissent will never protect human rights, end quote. Yet here we are, as American citizens, arguing against allowing dissent and mocking those who disagree with us for belonging to the wrong denomination, tuning in to the wrong media outlets, or listening to the wrong evangelists. Where does the United States stand today on the spectrum of a free society versus a fear society? I believe the line was crossed a long time ago, but the shades of gray made the line difficult to distinguish. It was too blurry to know for sure. It was the year 2020, however, that should have made it clear to all Americans that we now live in a fear society, not a free society. Our government is no longer protecting our rights, but easily taking rights from us. And it is difficult to see a path back from that reality as Americans celebrate the loss of rights for those who disagree with them.